Well, welcome to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9. But you may be listening on your own local Catholic radio station at a different time because the Catholic Reason is now aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. So if you're listening outside the Tulsa area, a very special welcome to you and thanks for joining me today. Note that you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. That's the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can also access the archived episodes of The Catholic Reason at my website, karlobroussard.com, under both the audio and video tabs. And be sure to check out all the other great resources that I have there available at my website, karlobroussard.com. All of the work that I do for Catholic Answers is hosted there in one location, so be sure to peruse the website. In today's episode, I'd like to think through a few issues that pertain to the question of God's existence. Atheists appeal to many things that they think eliminates the need for God, especially within the field of science. And one such thing is evolution. For example, in his 1986 book, The Blind Watchmaker, popular atheist Richard Dawkins stated, quote, "Although atheism may be logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist." That's on page 6 from his book, The Blind Watchmaker. Now, there are a variety of reasons why atheists think evolution eliminates God. I'd like to briefly outline a few of them here. The most common is that evolution eliminates the need for an intelligent designer. They think this because genetic mutations that take place in the evolutionary process are random and blind. Chance and design, so it's argued, are mutually exclusive. And if there's no design, well then there's no intelligent designer, like God. Another perceived problem is that if new beings emerge by chance in the evolutionary process, well then there's something in the universe that has escaped the reach of divine providence, something that wasn't part of the divine plan. Of course, if that's true, well then God isn't the universal cause and governor of all creatures, which is part and parcel of the classical definition of God. If you don't have a God that's the universal cause and governor of all creatures, then he ain't really God. These first two objections see chance as the nail in the divine coffin, and you may have intuited that. The other three objections that we'll consider in today's episode focus on other aspects of evolution. For example, some see the natural aspect of evolutionary theory as being incompatible with God as creator. If things come into existence via a natural process of evolution, so it's argued, well then there's no need for God to explain such things. The underlying assumption here is that it's either a natural explanation or God, both being mutually exclusive of each other. Another aspect of evolution that atheists see as a strike against God is the idea that more complex life forms come from simpler ones, which, if true, would seem to be a case of something coming to existence without a sufficient cause, without a sufficient explanation. How can the simpler life forms give rise to the more perfect when they don't have anything to give? How can they give that which they do not have? They can't. And to say that they are giving something that they don't have, that violates a fundamental principle of reason, the principle of sufficient reason, like something's coming from nothing. And finally, some see in evolutionary theory a wastefulness within the universe. Things coming and going, coming into existence, going out of existence to no purpose, which many think conflicts with any sort of divine wisdom that we would classically attribute to God. So these are the objections that we're going to consider in today's episode. So let's start with the first objection that I articulated previously, the one that says evolution eliminates the need for an intelligent designer because the genetic mutations that take place in the evolutionary process are random and blind. And the assumption being there that chance, the random genetic mutations, are mutually exclusive from any sort of purpose which would require an intelligent designer. Now, one way that philosophers respond to this sort of objection is to expose the flawed assumption, namely that chance and design are mutually exclusive. That's an assumption the objection makes, but that's an assumption that many philosophers, including myself, would challenge. Taking our cue from Aristotle, who had a bit to say on chance, philosophers who take this line of reasoning, again, including myself, chance is not some existing thing that can act in such a way as to bring about some effect. Rather, chance occurs when there's a convergence of causes that results in some effect that none of the converging causes directly intends. That's to say, those causes were not directly on the trajectory and directed toward producing that effect. Rather, the effect comes about accidentally on account of the causes converging in their lines of causality. Consider two stock examples. Everything I just said was a bit heady and abstract, so let's get more concrete here. Suppose I'm going to the grocery store to buy some milk so that my kids can eat cereal for breakfast. They love cereal, right? Suppose also that my colleague and good friend at Catholic Answers, Joe Heschmeyer, goes to the grocery store to buy some bread so that his kids can eat toast for breakfast. Suppose further that we meet at the grocery store. And of course, we start geeking out in theology and philosophy because that's what we do. Notice our meeting is by chance. He was not intending to see or meet me and geek out in philosophy and theology with me. I was not intending to see him and geek out in philosophy and theology at the grocery store. But that chance meeting presupposed at least some purposive action or design. I went to the store with a goal to get milk, to buy some milk, right? Joe went to the store with a goal in mind, to buy bread. The chance meeting was the convergence of those directed or designed purposeful actions. Another stock example is the discovery of treasure in the ground while digging a grave. The digger clearly intends to dig a hole. That's directed causal activity. It's purposeful. The person who buried the treasure intended to stash his loot, which is also directed activity. And the discovery of the treasure is an effect of the convergence of these causal actions, these purposeful actions. Now, what these examples show is that chance is not something primary in reality. It's not like a substance that acts on things to bring about some effect. It's secondary, something that's grafted onto or parasitic on something more primary. This is why philosophers say chance has an accidental character. And that which is more primary is the ordered activity or design. So chance is parasitic on designed or ordered activity. Now, this view of chance is no different when we're talking about evolution. The genetic mutations that give rise to new species via natural selection may be random. That is, the individual things and their causal activities that are involved are not ordered toward that specific effect. But that random occurrence presupposes a host of ordered or designed activity. There must be living things that act in such a way as to strive to survive and produce offspring. Certain things have tendencies to mutate into one thing rather than another. The carnivorous dinosaur may have had the tendency to evolve into a bird under the right conditions, but not a flower. Moreover, genetic mutation always involves some existing thing that acts on another. But as many philosophers have pointed out, anything that acts in such a way as to produce a specific effect or a range of effects. And the tendency toward producing such effects is inherent in that thing. It's baked into their nature, so to speak. For example, an acorn is a good example. Its activities aim at producing an oak tree instead of a banana tree. Such directional activity to a specific end or goal is what we call order or design. So rather than chance and design being mutually exclusive, as the objection assumes, you actually can't have chance without some design or directed activity. And if chance presupposes ordered activity, and ordered activity is that which necessitates a supreme intelligent designer, so a theist would argue, well, then chance events involved in evolution in principle cannot eliminate the need for an intelligent designer or God. Therefore, this first objection from evolution has no force against an intelligent creator. So, my friends, I'm coming up on my first break. Hit the pause button there. When we come back, we'll summarize what we said and move on to our next objection. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. In today's episode, we're talking about challenges to belief in God from evolution. Trying to answer the question, does evolution eliminate the need for God? In other words, can evolution be sufficient to explain things in our natural world without an appeal to God? And one objection from evolution, one reason why some might think that evolution eliminates the need for God, is that evolution involves random and blind genetic mutations. Thereby, it involves chance, which is assumed to be mutually exclusive with an intelligent designer or with purposeful activity, which would in turn require an intelligent designer like a creator. But as I was explaining in our first segment, this assumption that's baked into the objection from chance is false. When we understand chance properly, as I was articulating, chance is not mutually exclusive from purposeful activity. Chance is actually parasitic on purposive action. You can't have chance without directed, ordered, or purposeful activity. As I was explaining in our first segment, that chance is an effect and is an occurrence that comes about on account of the convergence of causal actions. One causal action having an intended purpose or a goal, another causal action having an intended purpose or goal, and those two causal actions converging, producing some effect that goes beyond those directed causal activities. And I used the example of me and my colleague Joe Heschmeyer going to the store. But the same line of reasoning can apply to genetic mutations. Within the evolutionary process, you have things that exist and things that act in accord with their natures in response to the environment. And all of those activities involve purposeful, directed activities to specific effects or ranges of effects. And at times, you have a convergence of those causal actions that bring about some occurrence that goes beyond the directed causal activity, and it's random. It's a chance occurrence. But that chance occurrence does not disprove the prior purposeful activity because you needed the purposeful activity in order to have the chance occurrence. And so we can see that chance in no way disproves purposeful activity. And if purposeful activity is going to require an intelligent designer, so we would argue as a theist, then it follows that chance occurrences in the evolutionary process in principle, cannot possibly be evidence against an intelligent designer. Now, there's a second objection from evolution, and it's the one that says if new beings emerge by chance in the evolutionary process, well, then there's something in the universe that has escaped the reach of divine providence, something that wasn't part of the divine plan. So this particular objection sees chance and divine providence as being mutually exclusive, the chance occurrence escaping the scope of divine providence, which would be the Creator's plan and the execution of the Creator's plan. One line of response to this objection that many philosophers take is to recall what I said previously, namely that chance is merely a convergence of causes that results in some effect that none of the converging causes directly intend, or there's no intentionality within the cause toward that effect, even if it's just a natural cause without any sort of consciousness. In the traditional theistic framework, such causal activity cannot escape God's providence because it's God's divine causal activity that explains why those causes act in the first place. Consider, for example, what St. Thomas Aquinas says in his Summa Contra Gentiles. This is coming from Book 3, Chapter 67. Here's what he writes. All power of any agent whatsoever is from God. So Aquinas here is talking about whether we're talking about a rational agent or the animal as an agent or even the plant acting as an agent. It's performing activities, right? So he goes on. All power of any agent whatsoever is from God, as from the first principle of all perfection. Therefore, since all operation is consequent to, it follows from some power, it follows that God is the cause of every operation. So anything that acts, Aquinas is saying here in the classical theistic framework, that action is caused by God as the primary cause. Divine and created causes, therefore, are not in competition with each other on this view. It's not either a created cause or a divine cause. Rather, it's a created cause because of the divine cause. This understanding of divine causality led St. Thomas Aquinas to articulate two aspects of God's divine providence, which is helpful for us here. In his Summa Theologiae, Aquinas writes in Part 1, Question 22, Article 3, quote, two things belong to providence, namely the type, the idea of the order of things foreordained towards an end, and the execution of this order, which is called government. As regards the first of these, that is the idea of the order, the plan, God has immediate providence over everything because he has in his intellect the types or the ideas of everything, even the smallest things. Aquinas goes on, as to the second, that is governance, the actual playing out of the plan, you might say, there are certain intermediaries of God's providence, for he governs things inferior by superior, not on account of any defect of his power, but by reason of the abundance of his goodness, so that the dignity of causality is imparted even to creatures. Given that on the traditional theistic view, God is the universal cause of all things outside himself, and thus is responsible for the activities, the acts, the actions by which secondary causes produce certain effects, it follows that God would know the convergence of all the causal acts that make up chance events, even within the evolutionary process. Because God's the one causing the causal activities of all of those things in the first place. So he would know the converging points of those causal activities and thereby the effects that would be brought about by chance within the created order. The convergence of causal activities involved in a chance occurrence, therefore, is simply part of the second aspect of God's providence, namely governance. From this, it follows that chance cannot possibly escape God's divine providence. Now, this naturally leads to another response that philosophers give. What is chance? What is chance relative to the causes that converge in their activity within the created order is not chance in relation to God. Aquinas argues along this line. Again, he writes in his Summa Theologiae, Part 1, question 116, Article 1, it happens sometimes that something is lucky or chance-like as compared to inferior causes, which, if compared to some higher cause, is directly intended. What Aquinas is getting at here is that the occurrences we identify as chance may be truly, factually beyond the natural activity of those converging causes, but not beyond a cause that directs those causes whose activities converge. Consider the example I gave previously. Suppose we add the detail that the grave digger was a poor man intentionally hired by a wealthy and kind employer who wanted the poor man to find the treasure that he buried many years ago. And not wanting the hired hand to know that it's his treasure, the wealthy employer doesn't tell the hired hand about the treasure. Relative to the hired hand, the finding of the treasure would be by accident or chance, since the finding of the treasure goes beyond the poor man's intended activity of digging. But relative to the wealthy employer, the finding of the treasure would not be by accident or chance because it was directly intended by him. The chance occurrence is ultimately reducible to the directing activity of an intelligent cause. Now, of course, the parallel is going to break down when it comes to God and creatures because the wealthy employer doesn't cause the poor man in his actual digging of the dirt, whereas God would do that with a creature, but you can see the similarity of the two situations. The same is true for chance occurrences in the world, including those that make up the evolutionary process. Relative to us and the converging causes involved in the evolutionary process, some occurrences do happen by chance. There is real chance or randomness. For example, the mutation of genes in certain small carnivorous dinosaurs that eventually led to the evolution of birds, assuming we accept that as valid, or the genetic mutations that led to aquatic animals developing the capacity to take in oxygen, that was beyond the specific range of effects that the elements of the environment naturally produce, and even the very activities of all of those things. But relative to God, such occurrences would not have been by chance, since all things act in the world and the effects that they produce, whether those effects are within the range of effects they naturally produce or beyond, are ultimately accounted for by the direct and causal activity of the supreme intelligence, i.e. God. So in light of these two responses, we can see that the emergence of new beings by chance in the evolutionary process does not necessarily suggest that something in the universe has escaped the reach of divine providence. The bottom line response here is that those random, chaotic, well, I wouldn't say chaotic, but random chance events are not chaotic precisely because they are intended by the universal cause, causing certain things to engage in their causal activities, and upon the convergence of those causal activities, you have some chance occurrence. My friends, I'm coming up on my next break. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio, based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa in Eastern Oklahoma. If you're just joining us, in today's episode, we're talking about objections to belief in God from evolution. And so far in today's episode, we've looked at two arguments against the need for God to explain things in the natural world from evolution by way of chance. For some, they think chance is mutually exclusive from purposeful activity, and thereby mutually exclusive with an intelligent designer. They think chance is evidence that disproves the need for an intelligent designer. But as we explained in today's episode, this is not the case because you cannot have chance unless you have purposeful activity. Things that act in certain specified ways, having causal activity, And whenever you have causal activities of different things converging, there you have chance occurrences. So those chance occurrences are parasitic on purposeful activity. And according to the theistic view, you cannot have purposeful activity unless you have an intelligent designer accounting for that purposeful activity of things within the created order. And so chance cannot, in principle, disprove the existence of an intelligent designer, because chance presupposes the intelligent designer that accounts for the purposeful activity that leads to chance. And we also looked at another objection from evolution that focuses in on chance, but in a little bit of a different way. Some say that chance is mutually exclusive from divine providence. If things happen within the evolutionary process by chance, well, then it would seem some things would escape the intended plan of the Creator, escape the scope or the reach of divine providence. But we responded to that objection by saying nothing could be further from the truth, because remember, in chance occurrences, you have a convergence of different lines of causal activity. Well, in the classical theistic framework, those lines of causal activity cannot exist cannot be or exist without the universal cause causing the very causal activities of those things. So the chance occurrences that come about from the convergence of the different lines of causal activity would indeed be known by the universal cause that's causing and directing those things to converge. Now, there's a third objection from evolution that I want to look at, and we're shifting away from chance, right? So this next objection from evolution shifts the focus away from chance into the natural aspect of evolutionary theory. If things come into existence via the natural process of evolution, so it's argued, well, then there's no need for God to explain such things, since we have natural causation. We don't need to go to God to explain things. We got natural processes. The underlying assumption here is that it's either a natural explanation or God. So if you got natural explanation, well, then you don't need God. The assumption is that both are mutually exclusive of each other. Now, this objection is pretty easy to answer given a proper understanding of God as the first cause within the classical theistic framework of things. According to classical theism, God is classically understood. God is the universal cause of all that exists outside himself. And if this is true, well, then it follows that everything involved in the evolutionary history of the cosmos depended ultimately on God to even come into existence and to remain in existence. If we were to imagine history as a line with the Big Bang serving as the starting point at one end of the line, and the emergence of simple life forms at another point in the middle of the line, and then perhaps the emergence of complex life forms at some other point later down the line, the whole timeline and everything that makes it up is dependent on the causal activity of God for it to be. Nothing on that timeline, nothing that makes up that timeline would escape the causal activity of God, at least God is classically conceived. Since natural explanations presuppose that things actually exist, and God is the ultimate cause of the existence of all things outside himself, well, then it follows that all natural explanations, whatever they turn out to be, in principle cannot eliminate the need for God. Because in order to even have a natural explanation, in order to even have something that exists within nature that can explain some outcome or event or effect, requires God as the cause of that thing's existence. This is why natural causation cannot, in principle, eliminate the need for God. So any appeal to the natural evolutionary process in order to eliminate God fails. Now, there's another way that we can respond here, which piggybacks off of my first response. Inasmuch as God is the universal cause of all things that exist outside himself, he's also the ultimate and primary cause of the very causal activity that these things engage in when they bring about certain effects. We already mentioned this earlier, but here it comes into play again. Of course, this follows the principle that action follows being. If God is the ultimate cause of a thing's existence or being, well, then God is going to be the ultimate cause of the thing's causal activity. Again, action follows the being. If the being is caused, the action is going to be caused. But God doesn't will to bring about effects directly by himself. He wills to work in and through what we call in philosophy secondary causes. It's kind of like instruments, bestowing upon certain things real causal power, such that the effects would be brought about truly and really from those things engaging in their causal activity. Remember the quote from Aquinas previously? There are certain intermediaries of God's providence, for he governs things inferior by superior. And here's the key money quote: so that the dignity of causality is imparted to creatures. That's from St. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologiae, Part 1, Question 22, Article 3. Now, any natural explanation, such as those involved in evolutionary theory and whatever they might be, necessarily entails the causal activity of things, natural things existing and acting upon each other. And since God is the ultimate reason why things act as causes in the first place, it follows that no natural explanation can be in competition with God as creator. Because the only reason why we have a natural explanation to begin with is because we have things existing and acting upon each other. And in the classical theistic framework, those things' existence and activity can only be accounted for by the primary cause, God. Okay, so that completes our response to the objection that appeals to the natural aspect of the evolutionary process, or natural causation in the evolutionary process. Another aspect of evolution that atheists see as a strike against God, and the fourth objection from evolution that we're considering in today's episode, is the idea that more complex life forms come from simpler ones, which, if were true, would seem to be a case of something coming to existence from nothing, coming into existence without a sufficient cause. How can simpler life forms give the more perfect something that they themselves don't have? It would seem the answer is they can't. In classical theism, the arguments for God's existence rely heavily on this principle that's driving this objection, that whatever perfection is not had by virtue of a thing's own essence, like in virtue of its own nature, that perfection is going to have to be received from something outside itself, or a cause. This is known as the principle of causality, right? Again, whatever perfection is not had in virtue of a thing's essence, it's going to have to get that perfection from something outside of itself. But evolution seems to prove this principle false. Therefore, it would seem that evolution breaks our path, blocks our path, you might say, to reasoning to God's existence. So how might we respond to this? Well, some philosophers respond to this objection by pointing out that although the emergence of new kinds of beings or organisms with more complex organization don't have a single cause, they may have many causes that concur with each other in an evolutionary event or evolutionary theory. And this gets back to evolutionary history. Sorry about that. This gets back to the convergence of those causal activities. In other words, there's an entire causal nexus, you might say, in which new beings emerge. Many different causes acting together, converging in their causal activity to bring about these new beings. There is, for example, the existing genetic material of a particular organism, the mutation itself, and the factors that contribute to the mutation, other things acting on the thing, whether it be radiation, chemicals, or the elements in the environment. These elements by themselves might not be sufficient to account for the emergence of something new, but when all of these things operate together, well, then they are sufficient. Dominican philosopher Benedict Ashley responds to this sort of objection in his 1972 paper, Causality and Evolution, published in the journal The Thomist. He writes that nuclear and chemical and biological evolution, although involving very different kinds of events, have this in common. And then he goes on to talk about how they're all acting together, acting on each other and with each other in a causal nexus to produce something new. But I'm coming up on my last break here, so I'm going to hit the pause button. On the other side of the break, I'll pick back up with Ashley's quote here concerning this issue. So, friends, note that you're listening to The Catholic Reason. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. On the other side, more to come concerning this objection that says evolution implies something's coming from nothing. Talk to you on the other side of the break. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. This is our last and final segment of today's episode. Before the break, I was beginning to respond to another objection from evolution that focuses on the more complex life forms coming from simpler life forms within the evolutionary process, which would seem to suggest that something is coming from nothing. And that's inconsistent with the traditional theistic account that reasons to God's existence. So this would seem to be a disproof of the need for God, since something's coming from nothing, more complex forms coming from simpler life forms. Now, in response, I was beginning to say that even though there might not be a single cause to account for some specific effect, an emergence of a new life form, that doesn't mean there's not a causal nexus, a convergence of a variety of different causes that can account for and be a sufficient explanation for the emergence of some new life form. This is the line of response that Dominican philosopher Benedict Ashley takes in his 1972 paper Causality and Evolution, published in the journal The Thomists. He writes this: nuclear, chemical, and biological evolution, although involving very different kinds of events, have this in common. Atom, molecule, and organism are products of historical events, no less complex and sequentially ordered than the entities which they produce. The new species is not a greater emerging from the less, because the amount of information it contains in integrated form is no greater than the amount of information present in the historical evolutionary process. What is spread out in history is condensed, as it were, in the emerging new species. So the emergence of the new species, he's arguing, is actually not greater and having more information than the historical evolutionary process that led to it. And so he's saying the information would be equal, and so you would not have something coming from nothing. So that's one way to respond. Even though there might not be a single cause, there may be a causal nexus that can sufficiently account for the emergence of new life forms. Now, a second possible answer is that there could very well be inherent potentials within things. So a theist could respond and say that whatever potentials things have to be actualized by the causal factors in the evolutionary process are ultimately accounted for by God's creative activity. So if there were potentials for some things to be actualized in the emergence of new life forms, God would be the explanation for that potential. And if a theist thinks it's metaphysically impossible, say for inorganic matter to have a potential to become organic, or plants to have a potential to become non-rational animals, well, the theist has the metaphysical reality of God as the sufficient cause to bring about those higher forms of being in matter. Science would simply be limited in detecting that causal activity. So it's simply false to say that evolution entails something coming from nothing without a sufficient reason. Therefore, evolution in no way blocks our path to reasoning to the conclusion that God exists. Now, there's one more objection from evolution that I want to look at. Rather than seeing evolution, and this will be our fifth objection from evolution in today's episode, rather than seeing evolution as eliminating the need for God to explain things in the world, like the previous four objections from evolution that we've been looking at so far in today's episode, this particular objection claims the evolutionary process contradicts God's wisdom. It's argued that if God existed, well, then he wouldn't have used a process like cosmic and biological evolution to create the things that make up the universe. Why would they say that? Well, cosmic and cosmological and biological evolution makes for a wasteful universe. Throughout its history, things come and go into existence, go out of existence to no purpose. Why not just create the universe immediately in its current state and avoid wasting so much stuff? So the wastefulness of the wastefulness within the evolutionary process is seen to be incompatible with an all-wise God. Since cosmic and biological evolution is the way things have come about, it's likely that God doesn't exist. In response, we can start by challenging the assumption that drives the objection. For example, we could ask the question, how do we know that things that have come and gone in the past were wasteful and to no purpose? That's an assumption the objection makes. But how do we know that? Many philosophers argue that we can't know. One reason they give is that we're limited by time and space. We don't have access to the details in the universe in the past, or, for that matter, the universe in the future. So we can't possibly judge that things of the past served no purpose whatsoever, whether for the current state of the universe or its future state. A more fundamental reason, however, that philosophers give is that we're finite beings with limited knowledge and power. God is infinite, with infinite knowledge and power. So we might not be able to conceive of a purpose to which the things of the past were directed. Thereby, it seems wasteful to us, but God can know the purpose to which those things of the past were directed. We might not have the power to direct the things of the past to a purpose, but God does. In fact, given God's infinite power, there is no purpose that he could not direct the things of the past to. Similar to what I said previously concerning chance, what might seem wasteful from our perspective is not necessarily wasteful from God's perspective. So just because we can't see a purpose for the things of the past in the history of cosmic and biological evolution, it doesn't mean there is no purpose. In fact, we should actually expect ourselves to not be able to see the purpose given the finitude of our knowledge. Now, a second response is that no thing that God creates can possibly be wasteful. So my first response was challenging the assumption that we would know it's wasteful. This response challenges the assumption that things are in fact wasteful. One reason why things would not be wasteful in the evolutionary process is because all created being manifests God's goodness in some way. As St. Thomas Aquinas writes in his Summa Theologiae, this is coming from Part 1, Question 47, Article 1, "For God brought things into being in order that his goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them." Since the very existence of a created being manifests or represents God's goodness, and manifesting or representing God's goodness is a purpose, well, then it's impossible that any created being be to no purpose, including the beings of the past that make up the history of cosmic and biological evolution. Their purpose was to manifest God's goodness. Aquinas provides us with another way that we can respond to this objection. He argues that it's more befitting of God's goodness to create many and diverse creatures rather than one creature alone. Why? Well, as he says in Part 1, Question 47, Article 1, because what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. When we apply this principle to the objection at hand, we can say that the diverse creatures that have come and gone throughout the history of cosmic and biological evolution were not wasteful because each manifested God's goodness in their own distinct way, not just generally, but in a very unique way. This principle even applies to the vastness of the universe in its current state. The multiplicity of beings that make up the cosmos is more apt to represent God's goodness than a small universe with only a few things. So in response to this objection of a wasteful universe, our first response is, how do you know it's wasteful, right? The objection assumes we know that things are wasteful. But how would we even know that? Given the finitude, given our place in history and the finitude of our knowledge, We shouldn't even expect to know that things are wasteful. What might seem wasteful to us would not be wasteful to an all-knowing, all-powerful God. And secondly, in response to this objection, we can challenge the assumption that things are in fact wasteful. This is not the case when we understand things properly from a philosophical perspective, that creatures in the classical theistic framework manifest the divine goodness, generally speaking, whatever exists. So it is metaphysically impossible in the classical theistic framework for some creature to be to no purpose and thereby be wasteful. And so that's how we can refute the underlying assumption of the charge. And then, of course, even the diversity of the grades of being cannot possibly be wasteful because each thing manifests the divine goodness in its own unique way. Well, my friends, that brings us to the end for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. My claim today is that evolution in no way eliminates the need for God in explaining the universe. The chance occurrences that are part and parcel of evolution do not disprove the existence of an intelligent designer, because the chance occurrences presuppose the purposeful activity of things which can only be adequately explained by an intelligent designer. The emergence of new beings via the chance convergence of causes within the evolutionary process does not escape the divine providence, because the causal activity of those causes is ultimately caused by God. Natural causes don't explain away the need for God, because within the framework of classical theism, those natural causes wouldn't be acting unless God is causing them to do so. And the more complex life forms that arise within evolution, they aren't coming from nothing, because there's a causal nexus that can account for those higher life forms. And finally, from a classical theist viewpoint, the apparent wastefulness in the evolutionary process in principle cannot be wasteful, because the very existence of such things manifests the divine goodness. Friends, thanks for listening to The Catholic Reason, again, a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can access all the episodes at my website as well, KarloBroussard.com. I invite you to join me again next week for The Catholic Reason. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless.